chairing Aaron's committee. Aaron was born and raised in Indianapolis. He earned a BA in political science at Carleton College, and then he moved to Alaska in 1996 and lived and worked in both Juneau and Bethel. He moved to northern Canada, first to Iqaluit and then to Whitehorse in 2000, and he's lived in Yellowknife since 2005. He's been the editor of Up Here magazine, published in Yellowknife for 8 years. And Aaron entered the program as a distance student, and he was such a model distance student in perspectives and really just elevated the conversation online. So I was so grateful to him because he was so dedicated as a student and also so well informed on northern issues in both Alaska and Canada. So he has wrestled with a very, very complex topic, and I'm not even going to go further on that because we've lost time here. I'll let him do that himself. But I do want to especially thank our committee members, Amy Lovecraft here in Fairbanks, and David Brock, who is the Chief Electoral Officer in Yellowknife, and Professor of Political Science Graham White at the University of Toronto, who generously gave up their time. There's no compensation for this. And I think that I'm assuming, I'm confident that their willingness to do this is partly because Aaron chose a fascinating topic on which they have a lot of expertise, but also because of their confidence in Aaron. They knew the work that he could perform, and I know that they have not been disappointed. So with that, I'll turn it over to Aaron.
Excellent, thanks.
Would you like to advance your slides so you can stand over here, or does it work? It does work.
That should work like that.
Great.
Yeah, somebody can hit the lights actually really quick. So thank you, Mary, for that introduction, and also a quick thanks to my thesis committee again, who's up here. I would thank you all separately, but we lost a few minutes, so I'm just going to launch into it. So the objective, well, firstly, let's go back right here. The title of my thesis is called Confronting Pimlico's Dilemma, Settler Voting Rights, Indigenous Representation of the 1998 Electoral Reapportionment in Canada's Northwest Territories. The objective of my thesis was to examine the 1998 electoral reapportionment that took place in Canada's Northwest Territories, the NWT. And an electoral reapportionment, for those of you Americans that may be more familiar as electoral redistricting, it's the drawing or redrawing of electoral maps so as to appropriately apportion representation in a representative democracy. So I wanted to look at that electoral reapportionment in the NWT because it was one that ultimately precipitated what was characterized at the time as a constitutional crisis in the territory, and probably was one of the most controversial reapportionments that's taken place, certainly in modern Canada. And my objective was to look at that reapportionment through 3 theoretical lenses and kind of the overlap of those lenses. The first was Northwest Territories' constitutional development up until 1999, which is when Nunavut Territory separated from the Northwest Territories. And so in 1999, we had a significant geographic and demographic change that took place in the Northwest Territories. The second theoretical lens is liberal theory. That's liberal as in liberties or rights. And this is specifically liberal theory as relates to individual and Aboriginal rights and sort of the intersection between those two. And then the third sort of theoretical lens I wanted to look through was electoral redistricting jurisprudence. So that's sort of the law and theory related to how representation is apportioned. So this is the intersection of all those topics that we're shooting for in this presentation. So let's first start with the Northwest Territories really quick and some geography. There's the Northwest Territories. As Mary said, that's where I've lived for the last decade, more or less. To you Alaskans, it would probably feel somewhat familiar. It's a place full of mountains and tundra and rivers and forests and about a gazillion lakes and, of course, long, dark, desperately cold winters. It's about 1.35 million square kilometers, which is 4/5 the size of Alaska, which is big, but it used to be quite a bit larger. Back in 1870, when the Northwest Territories joined Canada, it was incorporated into the Confederation of Canada. it sprawled across most of the top half of North America, basically. And over time, bits of it were carved away and turned into other provinces and territories. So we have the Yukon, we have Alberta and Saskatchewan formed in 1905, then Manitoba and Ontario and Quebec all stretch northward, so that by 1912, what's left of the Northwest Territories is this. Now, this area is still the size of Western Europe, so it's still huge, but it has a population at the time approximately of only about 8,000 people. So very few folks, almost entirely a nomadic indigenous population. In the west, mostly Athabascans, or in the Northwest Territories, we would say Dene people. In the east, mostly the Inuit or the Eskimo population. And then a very small population at the time of white fur traders and miners and the like. But none of these folks were calling the shots in the territory at the time. None of them had any political control. The people who were administering governance over the territory were these guys, a group of federal civil servants, and they didn't even live here. They lived down here in Canada's national capital of Ottawa. So for decades, the Northwest Territories was basically an internal colony of the country of Canada. It was administered from thousands of kilometers away in the south, and it was run by federal bureaucrats rather than elected representatives or governors of any kind. That situation persisted until 1967. That is when the federal government decided to devolve the seat of administration to the Northwest Territories itself. For that, they chose the relatively new and mostly non-Aboriginal mining town of Yellowknife, which is where I live. They put a bunch of federal bureaucrats on a plane, they nailed up a sign, they started hosting meetings at the Territorial Council, and then by 1975, we have for the first time a fully elected legislative assembly of the Northwest Territories. So for the first time, a fully elected body of people from the Northwest Territories governing the Northwest Territories. So in a sense, self-government had finally come to the Northwest Territories, to the NWT. It was about this time that one further geographic change is contemplated. The Inuit in the east are pressing at this time for the separation of the Northwest Territories and the formation of an Inuit-dominated jurisdiction that was going to be called Nunavut, our land. Over time, it was agreed that this would take place around 1999. That would leave this, the western Northwest Territories, looking like this. What would happen to it, what its constitutional future would be, was unclear. Whether it would become a province itself, whether it would subdivide further into more territories, whether Alberta, and Saskatchewan would reach northward and gobble it up, remained an open question, to be determined, obviously, presumably by 1999. So let's go from history really quick to demographics. When Yellowknife was made the capital, it began to boom. It became by far the largest community in the NWT, really the only city in the territory. It was wealthy, relatively well-educated, highly English literate, and it was also a very transient community, sort of like the Bush, Alaska. It had a high population, but it also had a very high population turnover. So even if there were 10,000 people living in Yellowknife, 10 years later it might be a different 10,000 people, or at least a significant proportion of those will have moved back south after spending some time in the north. And then finally, and perhaps unsurprisingly, it was about 80% non-native, 80% white, like so. And this made Yellowknife extremely distinct as compared to the rest of the Northwest Territories, most of which still looked more or less like this. It was rural, highly traditional, still very indigenous. Most of the communities, many of the communities, 90% native or more. So you end up with a territory that has historically been an Aboriginal homeland, has recently had an influx of non-natives to govern the territory based out of Yellowknife, and a growing city due to that influx of people from the south. So two very different demographic groups in the territory. And this is significant because when 1999 rolls around and Nunavut separates and takes that large body of Inuit separation of Nunavut is going to precipitate a dramatic demographic change to the Northwest Territories, to what's left of in the Northwest Territories. So, from demographics to constitutional vision, it probably would be unsurprising that with such separate demographic groups, you would have separate ideas about what the territory should become as 1999 approaches. For the non-Aboriginal population, they perceive this government, the Legislative Assembly, to be a legitimate government. They almost sort of presume that the Northwest Territories would aspire toward provincehood and join the greater Canadian family of provinces, just as other parts of the Northwest Territories had done in the past. And they also sort of take the liberal, civil rights-based political view that all Northerners should have the same rights, and there shouldn't be group differentiated rights based on whether you are Indigenous to the territory or whether you are a newcomer. The political rights should be equal and everybody should be politically treated in the same way. The Aboriginal population, by and large, or a significant portion of them anyway, have a different view. In the 1970s, they became much more politicized. They became sort of politically active. And their perception of the NWT Legislative Assembly is that it is not wildly different from these guys in the past, that both of these governments are basically colonial, southern-imposed administrations. And what they aspire for their homeland is a different kind of government, one that would be effectively Aboriginal flavored and Aboriginal controlled, that would provide a rejection of colonialism, protection of their traditional native autonomy, and providing them with native self-determination, the ability to sort of choose their own political future. So you have different demographic groups, very different visions, by and large, of what the territory should become, and a deadline, as it were, of 1999 to get this all kind of figured out. So let's go, that kind of covers Northwest Territories constitutional development. Now we're going to see how liberal theory overlaps with this. I'm going to be talking about sort of three areas of rights. The first one being individual rights. We have a map of Canada. We have individual Canadians. Under the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, under Section 6, all Canadians as individuals enjoy the right to mobility, which means they can move around the country at will. And they also, under Section 3 of the Charter, have the right to vote, which means that anyone can move where they want and vote where they move. Those are individual rights under the Charter. So the second kind of rights are national rights. As a collectivity, a nation of peoples, which we have here, Canadians, like most sovereign peoples, assert the rights to autonomy, which is to say, if you have a whole bunch of outsiders who want to move in and swamp your local population, they can't do it due to limits on mobility. That's why countries have external borders. And moreover, the nation of Canadians assert the right to self-determination, the ability to choose as a nation what their political future will be. If somebody from outside, if immigrants are allowed in, they're not going to be able to vote immediately until they become a citizen themselves. I was an American who moved to Canada in 2000, and it took about 8 years before I was able to actually get Canadian citizenship. And sort of the one right I could own land, I could do all sorts of things as an American immigrant in Canada, but the one right that I couldn't exercise was the right of actually voting, the right of citizenship. So citizenship and voting are integrally tied together in most Western liberal democracies. The third right that we're going to go into is Aboriginal rights, and this is the most challenging one in this context. So we have here an Aboriginal homeland and Aboriginal peoples, a collectivity of peoples. They, like Canadians as a whole, assert the right to autonomy and the right to self-determination. The complication comes in the face of what academics often call settler colonialism, where you have a population of exogenous peoples. Obviously, the population that currently occupies Canada, for the most part, was not from there originally. Canada used to be an Aboriginal dominated jurisdiction. Europeans moved in. They arrived at the back door of the Northwest Territories about 4 or 5 decades ago, and they, as Canadians, enjoy, under the Charter, these individual rights to mobility and voting. You can see the conflict that's going to arise. When Aboriginals assert the right to autonomy over their homeland, if individuals attempt to exercise their mobility rights, they potentially will not be able to. Conversely, if they are able to exercise those mobility rights, then Aboriginal autonomy arguably will be breached. Same thing with self-determination. If Aboriginal self-determination is maintained in the Northwest Territories and the non-Aboriginals can't vote, then their voting rights in a jurisdiction of Canada are uniquely denied. And conversely, if they are able to move to the Northwest Territories and cast a ballot, then they have the potential, if they're numerous enough, to sort of be able to dominate that jurisdiction. And that raises questions about what happens to Aboriginal self-determination. So this phenomena, where Aboriginal rights potentially cancel out individual rights and vice versa, is what I, in my thesis, characterized as Kinlicka's dilemma. And that is after this guy, Will Kinlicka, who is a Canadian scholar based out of Queen's University, who probably for the past 20 or 25 years, I suppose, has kind of led the international discourse on the rights of, the challenges over according rights to minority peoples in liberal democracies. So it was sort of my thesis in this thesis that this conflict that's playing out between the two demographic groups in the Northwest Territories can be understood through the lens of this clash of rights. So that's how liberal theory, as pertains to Aboriginal and individual rights, intersects with Northwest Territories constitutional development. And I suggest that it all sort of came to a head when you throw electoral redistricting into the mix. So let's look at redistricting really quick. We all know that in representative democracies, we participate in democracies through elected representatives. In order to do that, we have to, well, most countries, representation is apportioned by geographic districts, such as this. So here in Fairbanks, for instance, people would vote. They would vote for a specific representative who represents a geographically delimited area. Same thing in the Northwest Territories. And what we also know is that periodically these districts, these maps of representation have to be redrawn to account for demographic changes or legal changes or things like that, population changes. If the number of seats in the Legislative Assembly are increased or decreased, you're going to have to redraw your redistricting map. So, like so. Now, you can see that, there are different principles upon which representation can be apportioned. And that comes into play in the Northwest Territories. You could apportion representation based on territory, on area alone, or by rural overrepresentation, basically, which would facilitate Aboriginal self-determination in the Northwest Territories, where we draw a district basically for all 3 of our rural Aboriginal folks, and we concentrate our Yellowknifers all together in one district. And you can see by this scheme that, of course, the rural areas are going to control the Legislative Assembly. If that seems unfair, then recall that overrepresentation is integral to the U.S. federal scheme. It's why Alaska enjoys dramatically greater per capita representation in Congress and in the Electoral College than does California or more populous states like that. So you can see on this map, these are representative of the per capita weight, basically, that voters have in the Electoral College. So the question arises then, is rural overrepresentation in the Northwest Territories going to be a violation of individual rights, or is it permissible? A sort of countervailing principle for apportioning representation would be one person, one vote, where all 3 of our rural folks, once again, get their own writing, but we evenly divide all the urbanites as well, so that all of the populations, all the districts are equally populous. that seems unfair, then realize that state legislative redistricting in the United States is mostly, pretty much completely compelled to adhere to one person, one vote, which explains why in Alaska, Anchorage is just a speck on the map, but population-wise, it all but dominates the legislative assembly of the state. So in the Northwest Territories context, is this okay, or does it impermissibly violate self-determination? It's worth noting that the general Canadian standard for apportioning representation is not this. It's not one person, one vote, nor is it that, an extreme degree of over-representation. Rather, it's a middle ground of plus or minus 25% departure from parity. And what that means is that basically, if your average sized district in your jurisdiction has 4 people, then the largest permissible district would be a 5-person district, which would be 25% above parity, above the average. So that is the general Canadian standard, but it's not written hard and fast into law. And the question arises then, in unique circumstances such as the Northwest Territories, does that plus or minus 25% departure standard apply? And that's what we're going to find out. So that's electoral redistricting jurisprudence, political theory, Northwest Territories constitutional development, and there in the middle, hopefully, we're going to find the 1998 electoral reapportionment, which I studied for my thesis. To do that, I looked at an array of public documents, for the most part. These were electoral boundaries reports, legislative transcripts, documents from both the NWT Supreme Court and the Court of Appeals, and reports from the national and local media. And, excuse me. What I found, firstly, is that the conflict that played out over the 1998 electoral reapportionment sort of pitted rural legislators, members of the Legislative Assembly, and Aboriginal leaders on one side, and Yellowknife members of the Legislative Assembly and Yellowknife municipal officials and business officials on the other side. Going into this apportionment, the reason it was ostensibly seen as being necessary was because, of course, Nunavut was going to separate in 1999, meaning that the Assembly of the Northwest Territories was going to have to be cut in half. If nothing was changed, the new Northwest Territories was going to have a 14-seat assembly, of which Yellowknife was going to occupy just 4 seats, so 4 or 14. Of these seats, one of these Yellowknife seats was actually going to be slightly less populous than the territorial average, so below parity. One of them was going to be about 19% above. Yellowknife North was going to be 49% above parity, so well above that general Canadian 25% threshold. And then there was the infamous Yellowknife South district, which was gargantuanly, laughably, overly large at that time. It experienced dramatic growth since the last time the districts had been readjusted. So these 2 districts, of course, are out of line with what would be typically accepted in southern Canada. Out of concern for those 2 districts, the Electoral Boundaries Commission, when it was impaneled by the Legislative Assembly, recommends dealing with those 2 districts by increasing Yellowknife's share of representation in the Northwest Territories from 4 seats of 14 to 6 of 16. So increasing the number of seats in the overall Legislative Assembly by 2, both of which would go to Yellowknife, and the rural areas would get no more representation in the new Northwest Territories Assembly. That would leave the average of the 6 Yellowknife ridings, the average of these ridings would be 18% above parity. So they would still be over the territorial average, but under that 25% threshold, it's not quite one person, one vote, but it's a heck of a lot closer than 152% above parity. So the Boundaries Commission report goes to the Legislative Assembly, these guys, and they deliberate about it. As you can imagine, the Yellowknife legislators and some of their supporters are in favor, of course, of the idea of increasing the share of but the rural legislators are opposed. We know that the Northwest Territories, of course, has been politically divided for several decades up until this point. Nunavut is about to separate. The demographics of the territory are about to dramatically change. The rural legislators argue that this is the worst possible time to suddenly change the balance of power in the Legislative Assembly, with the territories about to go through this kind of dramatic alteration in its geographic and demographic statistics. Because the rural legislators are more numerous, of course, they occupy the 10 seats that are not Yellowknife seats. They are able to vote this down and reject it. That means the 6-seat proposal is defeated in favor of the status quo for 14 seats. And it means that, for now at least, these two egregiously underrepresented ridings, electoral districts, are going to stay in place. The Aboriginal leaders are fine with that. Yellowknifers, however, are pretty upset.
Welcome. Please enter your conference access code followed by the pound key. This menu will repeat.
A group called Friends of Democracy, and they file a case in the Northwest Territories Supreme Court. In their argument, this is in December of 1998, and Nunavut is going to be created in April of 1999. In their argument to the Supreme Court, they argue that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms accords rights to Canadians as individuals, and it gives everyone an individual and equal right to vote. They argue that while this is okay, it's okay to overrepresent rural areas because of rural areas' potentially special challenges, that this is not okay. It is illegal to overconcentrate voters in a single riding when they are sort of egregiously underrepresented in this way. This is a violation, a debasement of their individual equal voting rights. So Yellowknife, the Friends of Democracy, argue that the solution to this is obviously what the Electoral Boundaries Commission proposed, drawing at least 2 more ridings for Yellowknife, and their voting rights are going to be protected. So the defendant in this case, Friends of Democracy versus the Northwest Territories, the defendant is the Northwest Territories government, which, as we said, is dominated by the rural legislators. Their submission, their defense to the court, is also based on the Charter. They maintain that the Charter Section 3 Voting Rights Clause does not merely encompass an individual right to vote, but a broader conception of representative democracy, which could be summed up in the phrase better government. And in the Northwest Territories, they argue that given the sort of fraught constitutional clash that has been playing out in the Northwest Territories, better government, at this instance in history, demands a balance of power between the rural and the urban areas being maintained. That better government, by according individual rights to vote at this very moment, better government would be not maintained, but in fact eroded. And so better government in this case should trump the specific individual rights issue. They further argue that Yellowknifers are receiving an effective representation in the Northwest Territories. They have a variety of advantages, it's maintained, over the rural areas. Once again, they have easy, direct access to legislators and government services. The Legislative Assembly is in their backyard. Thousands of Yellowknifers work for the Northwest Territories government, so in a sense, at least in the view of rural residents in the Northwest Territories, Yellowknifers are the government of the Northwest Territories. Further, as we mentioned earlier, Yellowknife is comparatively wealthy, well-educated, highly English language literate, and also very transient. Wealthy and booming. So the argument is that Yellowknife has not been disadvantaged by these sort of previous decades of underrepresentation in the Northwest Territories Assembly. And further, they note that Yellowknife is highly transient, which is relevant because the argument is that while 100% of Aboriginals voters are going to have to live under the laws that are passed by the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly, that only a relatively somewhat smaller proportion of Yellowknifers are actually going to have to live under those laws. That every 5 years there's a fairly high percent turnover, and therefore Yellowknifers do not have as much of a stake in the laws that are passed by the Assembly, especially as it comes to sort of determining the constitutional shape that the territory is about to take. So at this especially fraught time, they say it doesn't make sense that Yellowknifers who are going to be leaving in 5 years should be able to determine the perpetual future of the Northwest Territories government. So for all of these reasons, they maintain that Yellowknife is enjoying effective representation in the Legislative Assembly. They moreover note that while that figure looks very large, the number of actual people in that district is actually only about 7,000. So in absolute numbers, it's relatively small. By comparison, the average legislative district in Alaska, I think, has about 17,000 people in it for the House of Representatives. And in the state of California, the average legislative district is upwards of 400,000. So much larger districts are going to be found in southern or other jurisdictions. The argument is that one legislator can perfectly adequately serve 7,000 people and that they can't complain that they're not receiving effective representation. So for all of these reasons, it is maintained that this is permissible, that individual rights to vote are still being upheld in the Northwest Territories. So that concludes the Northwest Territories government's defense in the Friends of Democracy versus Northwest Territories case. But there's one other participant in that case, and that's Aboriginal groups who petition the Northwest Territories Supreme Court to participate as interveners. They are accepted as interveners, and so they file a submission as well. They base their argument on the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. They maintain that while Section 3 may well guard the individual voting rights of all Canadians, it also recognizes Aboriginal rights. And what they maintain is that in situations like this, where representation is apportioned in such a way that it would eliminate the self-determination possibilities of an Indigenous population, that the Charter prohibits that. There's a clause in the Charter called Section 25, which is called the non-derogation clause, which basically prohibits the abrogation and derogation from Aboriginal rights by other rights in the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. And the Constitution Act of Canada guarantees the inherent right of self-government. So they maintain that their inherent right to self-government is being attempted to be trumped by this representational scheme that is being attempted to be foisted upon them. So that's their argument in the Supreme Court. The court listens to all these arguments, it thinks about them, and it renders its verdict, which falls in favor of the Friends of Democracy, the Yellowknife side. It argues, as the Yellowknifers argued in the first place, that this is okay, you can over-represent rural areas in the Northwest Territories, that's great, but it's not permissible if it leads to a concomitant over-representation of urbanites. If you under-represent people to such a degree that it compels you to pack urbanites together to such a degree that you end up with numbers like that, then the individual right to vote has been debased to such a degree that it has been effectively denied, impermissibly violated. They maintain that it doesn't matter that Yellowknife South has 7,000 people. It doesn't matter that Yellowknife has all of these sort of ease of access to legislators and these various kind of purported advantages as compared to the rural areas. What matters, first and foremost, in the apportionment of representation in Canada is this figure here, the relative degree of equality of the weight of your vote in a legislative assembly. So ultimately, they argue that this particular figure in this case is far too high to be permissible, and once again, they suggest the solution to protecting the right to vote is going to be increasing the number of ridings for urbanites. So this ruling, which happens in early March of 1999, throws the Northwest Territories into what is characterized as constitutional chaos. If you notice the date on that news story there, it's March the 29th, 1999. Nunavut becomes a territory on April the 1st, 2 days later. The Northwest Territories effectively has had their districting scheme invalidated at the cusp of division with an election slated for 6 months from then. So the status quo is impermissible. The legislature had rejected the new 6% representation. We've got to solve this problem and give urbanites an equal right or fair right. Appeals are made by Aboriginal groups to the federal government, including even an appeal to have Ottawa dissolve the Northwest Territories legislature and return control of the Northwest Territories to Ottawa to sort of bring colonialism, overt internal colonialism, back to the Northwest Territories. That's that request. The Aboriginal groups also file an appeal in the NWT Court of Appeals that ultimately is rejected. And then finally the legislature sits down and has a fight for several months with headlines like "The House is divided," members of the Legislative Assembly struggle over new seats, democracy on hold. But finally, the Assembly is compelled to sort of hold its nose, if you will, I suppose, and pass a proportional scheme that increases Yellowknife's share of seats in the Assembly from 4 of 14 to 7 of 19, which means Yellowknife gets 3 more seats, and 2 sort of semi-rural communities in the outlying areas also get an additional seat, and the overall body is increased to a 19-seat legislative assembly. And with that, the legislative session ends, and the reapportionment of 1998-99 comes to an end. And that brings me to my conclusion. Not surprisingly, I suppose, in the view of many Yellowknifers, certainly Friends of Democracy, justice has been served in this particular case. They see individual rights as having been upheld by the court and by the legislative actions. It has guaranteed the right of all individual Canadians to enjoy mobility, including mobility to the Northwest Territories and the ability to cast a vote there. So, from that point of view, this seems eminently fair within representative democracy, liberal democracy. From the Aboriginal perspective, of course, many Native leaders and the Aboriginal people see this as being a different sort of scenario. They see it as sort of an insidious version of colonialism, whereby they have occupied a traditional Aboriginal homeland for 10,000 years. In recent centuries, an exogenous population has moved in, arrived at their doorstep, and claims individual rights that allow them to move in, and if not immediately dominate the jurisdiction, then it has paved the way for further influx and further voting of Southerners in Yellowknife, which would potentially lead to the domination by non-Aboriginals of the Northwest Territories legislative. So, what I hypothesize, or what I sum up in conclusion, is that in this instance of Kinlicka's dilemma, this clash between Aboriginal rights and individual rights, within the Northwest Territories Legislative Assembly, at the cusp of Nunavut's creation, individual rights were able to trump Aboriginal rights.